Hello and welcome to the Fundamentals of Advanced Pharmacology. This series is broken up into several parts, so I'm going to begin with part 1. All body functions, disease processes, and most drug actions occur at the cellular level. Our cells are composed of water, electrolytes, proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates. Water makes up about 70% of most cells. Cellular enzymes, electrolytes, and other chemicals are dissolved or suspended in water. Electrolytes provide chemicals for cellular reactions and are required for some processes such as transmission of electrochemical impulses in nerve and muscle cells. Phospholipids and cholesterol are the main lipids that form the cell membrane that separates structures inside the cell and the cell itself from the surrounding cells and body fluids. So this is a double layer of lipids with the phospholipids. The phospholipids are made out of fatty acids and phosphate. So the phospholipids molecules, they are interspersed with proteins. These proteins are usually combined with carbohydrates called glycoproteins. These are found attached to and cover the entire outside surface of the cell. Carbohydrates in the cell membrane occur mainly in combination with proteins. These proteins are the like glycoproteins or lipids or glycolipids. Carbohydrates play a major role in cell nutrition. Glucose is present in the extracellular fluid and is readily available to supply the cell's need for energy. Small amount of carbohydrate is stored within the cell as glycogen, which can be rapidly converted back to glucose when needed. Many of the carbohydrates act as receptor molecules for binding hormones, and for example, that would be insulin. All human cells are limited by a lipid bilayer membrane. So here is an example of the lipid bilayer. That's what our cells would be composed of. The membrane lipids consist of mainly phospholipids, sterols such as cholesterol, and glycolipids. Because our cells are surrounded by other cells and body fluids, the inside of the cell are structurally hydrophobic, which means water hating, fear of water. So you'll see this term used, hydrophobic. With a hydrophobic core, it presents a major barrier to drug transport. So only small non-polar molecules such as steroid hormones and drugs that are acidic, because these are non-polar or unionized form of drugs, these acidic drugs, they will readily cross the lipid bilayer. And others are like oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen. They will most readily cross the lipid bilayer. Some proteins provide structural pores through which water and water-soluble substances such as sodium, potassium, and calcium ions can diffuse between extracellular and intracellular fluids. Other proteins act as carriers to transport substances through the cell membrane, and there are some proteins that regulate intracellular function or as enzymes to catalyze chemical reactions within the cell. The nucleus regulates the types and amounts of proteins, enzymes, and other substances to be produced. The cytoplasm surrounds the nucleus and contains the working units of the cell. The cytosol, the clear fluid portion of cytoplasm, contains dissolved proteins, electrolytes, and glucose. The endoplasmic reticulum contains ribosomes which synthesize proteins, including enzymes that synthesizes glucose, triglycerides, steroids, and those that metabolize drugs and other chemicals. The endoplasmic reticulum is also important in the production of hormones by glandular cells and the production of plasma proteins by liver cells. The mitochondria generate energy for cellular activities, and these require oxygen. Lysosomes are enclosed membrane vesicles that contain enzymes that digest nutrients such as proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. And this lysosome also, they digest other cells, like your damaged cells, cellular structures, foreign substances, for example, bacteria, and the cell itself. When a cell becomes worn out or damaged, the membrane around the lysosome breaks and the enzymes or hydrolases are released. However, with the release of the contents of the lysosomes, it may spill into the extracellular spaces and destroy surrounding cells. To prevent excessive tissue destruction, the enzymes are inactivated by enzyme inhibitors. Drugs must reach and interact with or cross the cell membrane to stimulate or inhibit cellular function. Most drugs are given to affect body cells that are distant from the sites of administration. To move through the body and reach their sites of action, metabolism, and excretion, drug molecules must cross many cell membranes. For example, molecules of most oral drugs must cross the membranes of cells in the gastrointestinal tract, liver, and capillaries to reach the bloodstream, circulate to their target cells, and leave the bloodstream and attach to the receptors on the cells, then perform their action, and then return to the bloodstream, circulate back to the liver, reach drug metabolizing enzymes in the liver cells to be broken down to create metabolites which are usually less active chemically than the original drug molecule, but in some cases there are some metabolites that could be powerful. So please note that the liver is the primary site of drug metabolism. Other organs such as the kidneys, gastrointestinal tract, and lungs may also perform metabolic functions. So now once these drugs are activated upon by the drug metabolizing enzymes in, for example, in the liver, by the liver cells, it's broken down into metabolites, and then these metabolites, they re-enter the bloodstream, they circulate to the kidneys, and then they get excreted in the urine. Drug transport pathways takes place in three main pathways. Drug molecules cross cell membranes to move into and out of body cells to directly penetrate the lipid bilayer, diffusing through open or gated channels, or attaching to carrier proteins, Once absorbed into the body, drugs are transported to and from target cells by simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and active transport. In simple diffusion, the molecules move without the aid of membrane proteins. Simple diffusion is a type of passive diffusion. The most common mechanism involves movement of a drug from an area of higher concentration to one of lower concentration. For example, after oral administration, the initial concentration of a drug is higher in the GI tract than in the blood. This promotes movement of the drug into the blood. When the drug is circulated, the concentration is higher in the blood than in the body cells, so the drug moves from the capillaries into the fluid surrounding the cells or into the cells themselves. Passive diffusion continues until a state of equilibrium is reached between the amount of drug in the tissues and the amount in the blood. The most common pathway is direct penetration of the membrane by lipid-soluble drugs, which can dissolve in the lipid layer of the cell membrane. Most systemic drugs are formulated to be lipid soluble, so they can move through cell membranes. Even oral tablets and capsules must be sufficiently water soluble to dissolve in the aqueous liquids of the stomach and small intestine. Facilitated diffusion is a similar process, except that drug molecules combined with a carrier substance such as an enzyme or other protein. This is the most common way for glucose and amino acids to enter cells. This pathway involves passage through protein channels to go all the way through the cell membrane. Only a few drugs can use this pathway because most drug molecules are too large to pass through the small channels. Small ions such as sodium and potassium use this pathway, but their movement is regulated by specific channels with a gating mechanism. So the gating mechanism, a flap of protein that opens briefly to allow the ions to move in, and then the flap closes. In active transport, drug molecules are moved from an area of lower concentration to one of higher concentration. Because this process goes against the concentration gradient, this process requires a carrier substance and the release of cellular energy in the form of adenosine triphosphate. So that's ATP. ATP is the main energy molecule used in cells. If you recall in pathophysiology, you learned about the cell functions. Our cells have organelles called mitochondria that mainly function as ATP producers during cellular respiration. So mitochondria is sometimes referred to as the powerhouse of the cell. The active transport pathways involves carrier proteins that transport molecules from one side of the cell membrane to the other. But the carrier proteins are selective in the substances they transport. A drug's chemical structure determines which carrier will transport it. So here's a table that I made, factors that determine the intensity of drug responses. In pharmacologic, drugs can come in solids, liquid, inhaled, or topical. and administration of the dose that are made available to help get absorbed into the circulatory system, and the best route which the drug should be administered depends on the routes of administration, on the physiochemical properties of the drug, the molecular weight of the drug, fat or water soluble, and ionization of the drug. And it's also affected by medication error, factors that affect individual use and responses. And then we have the pharmacokinetics, what the body does to the drug. So we have, ADME, which is absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion, and pharmacokinetics can be affected by the characteristics of the drug, variable absorption through the GI tract, individual genetic variables, disorder that can alter pharmacokinetics, and drug interactions. And then we have pharmacodynamics, is what the drug does to the body. So the drug receptor interactions is determined by that. Therapeutic effects, adverse reactions, and then pharmacodynamics can be affected by the individual genetic variables, disorders that can alter the pharmacokinetics and drug interactions. So this actually concludes part 1 of the fundamentals of advanced pharmacology, and we'll be back with the part 2, which I'll be discussing pharmacokinetics, and then part 3, pharmacodynamics. So I will present that, and hopefully you will subscribe and listen to more upcoming PowerPoint presentation. Thank you very much for watching.